The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has something called the Doomsday Clock. The hands on this clock represent our proximity to total annihilation as a species due to the likelihood of impending nuclear war. The clock strikes midnight when the nukes start to fly. As of this time in the current year of 2019, the clock's hands sit at 2 minutes to midnight. Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' 1986 and 87 superhero maxi series Watchmen, arguably one of the most impactful and bleakest works of genre fiction of the 20th century, starts with a story at a then unthinkable 5 minutes to midnight. It tells a superhero tale which archetypes of the Silver Age of comic books like grizzled gumshoes, ingenious inventors, military hardmen, sexualized femme fatales, and genuine ubermensch are characterized in confrontingly real ways that no superhero story has emulated or replicated since.
Watchmen is set in a world where masked crime fighters came into existence after being inspired by the saccharine, idealistic golden age of superhero comic books in the 1940s. With the help of a shrewd publicist, a group of these garishly costumed vigilantes capture the imagination of the American people and become a national pastime as the Minutemen. But after the war ends, this original generation of costumed heroes disintegrates due to infighting and tribulations over homosexuality, mental instability, rape, and murder. The world fundamentally changes when a genuine Superman named John Osterman, dubbed Dr. Manhattan by the state, comes into existence with the arrival of the 1960s. A victim of a gruesome accident in a military aerospace lab, he becomes capable of impossible feats like energy manipulation, teleportation, temporal foresight, and is hyper-intelligent. With godlike power, he's coerced by President Nixon to intervene in the Vietnam War. A week later, the war is over. Soon thereafter, vigilantism is completely outlawed and the status quo of the world rests on America's dominion through the unmatchable threat of Dr. Manhattan. The story proper begins with the death of the comedian, one of the original Minutemen, a rapist and military operative. A psychotic, ultra-conservative masked detective named Rorschach begins to investigate the suspicious circumstances of the comedian's death and slowly unravels a conspiracy involving the agitation of tensions between Russia and America in which all former masked heroes are potential targets. The dark and disturbing themes of Watchmen made the American cultural consciousness aware that comic books weren't just for children anymore, and older audiences no longer felt the stigma of liking stories which had ostensibly been created to sell confectionery and toys to children. Alongside Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns series, Watchmen compelled comic book publishers to lean into a new era where more adult themes became increasingly marketable as adults with dispensable income became a more viable target audience. While the industry nearly imploded in its attempts to grapple with this newfound creative freedom, that digression is another report in and of itself, but what is important that Watchmen still stands as a landmark title to this day for several important reasons, all of which play into its lack of a true rival in terms of deconstructing superheroes and their character tropes. The first highlights the importance of creators' rights in the world of comic book publishing. The critical reception of Watchmen was overwhelmingly positive, winning a Hugo Award in 1988 and eventually making Time magazine's all-time top 100 list of greatest novels in 2005. It was also a great commercial success for DC Comics, briefly allowing the publisher to overtake its rival Marvel Comics for a brief period of time. The control over the intellectual property of Watchmen, however, became a sticking point with the writer Alan Moore and DC. The reversion clause of Moore and Dave Gibbons' contract stated that the rights to the characters of Watchmen revert to Moore and Gibbons a year after the book had gone out of print. Moore eventually left DC Comics in 1989 with the finishing of V for Vendetta, as Moore felt that the reversion clause was meaningless as the publisher had no intention of letting his books go out of print. While publishing corporations have a long history of financially mistreating their creative talent, Siegel and Schuster are a good starting place in a long list. Moore's exodus from DC was felt sharply alongside the leavings of Frank Miller, Marv Wolfman, and Howard Chaykin. Similar things happened over at Marvel Comics, and the vacuum of powerhouse creative talents led to the creation of new publishers with a focus on creator ownership like Image Comics. It changed the way writers are paid for their creations, but it made mainstream publishers increasingly risk-averse, and has resulted in superhero comics consistently recycling characters and plot threads through the use of retcons, as said publishers more often don't automatically gain the rights to creators written under their label. The second reason why Watchmen was so important was that it was a heavy-handed but necessary overcorrection to the censorship and creatively stifling landscape of the mainstream, i.e. superhero comics industry. The Comics Code Authority had been created in 1954 by the Comics Magazine Association of America in order to address public concerns over gruesome content comic books being sold to children. and to avoid the presence of government regulation. The criteria of the CCA was initially rigidly defined by standards befitting of the Cold War era, and by the 1970s had led to the decline of comic genres like romance, horror, and westerns, as well as repressing publications by people of color and philosophically objectionable material in a time of communist witch hunting. The code was eventually updated, and by the 1980s, gore and lewd content had become more commonplace once more. But few, if any, mainstream works had dared to try and present confronting narratives that rose above the tropes established in their respective genres. Alan Moore's own little-known work at the time on Marvel Man/Miracle Man in Britain and Harvey Picar's American Splendor were excellent precursor titles to Watchmen that were written with adults in mind, but for one reason or another didn't find the same kind of worldwide renown that Watchmen did. The third and most lasting reason why Watchmen was so impactful was its characters, and more succinctly how they subverted the mechanism of childish power fantasy into a mirror for the reader's sense of escape, and then used that mechanism to unnerve to the point where self-reflection is unavoidable. Though often regarded as one of the most truly original works of superhero fiction put to page, Watchmen actually began life as an adaptation of characters acquired from a failed DC competitor, Charlton Comics. Moore intended to create a miniseries involving Silver Age superhero fixtures including the Blue Beetle, The Question, Peacemaker, Captain Atom, Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, and Nightshade. DC had plans to incorporate the Charlton characters into the main DC continuity, but they liked Moore's pitch for the story, and so the characters were changed. Blue Beetle became Night Owl, The Question became Rorschach, Peacemaker became the Comedian, Captain Atom became Dr. Manhattan, Peter Cannon became Ozymandias, and Nightshade became the Silk Spectre. The primary protagonist and narrator of the story is the grizzled but brutally violent and socially conservative Rorschach. Sporting a private dick's outfit replete with a fedora and a mask that displays a constantly shifting inkblot painting, Rorschach paints the world of Watchmen with a pessimistic, poetic fervour as he likens the seedy world populated by thugs, pedophiles, and pornographers to vermin deserving of biblical vengeance. He is paranoid in the extreme, but bound by a principle of loyalty to his fellow costumed heroes regardless of what he thinks about their personal lives, and he makes sure to tell all those he knows that they may be in danger following the murder of the comedian. But, as with most of the characters in Watchmen, he is a fundamentally broken man, driven to his conservative worldview and life as a crime fighter by a loveless childhood as a prostitute's unwanted son. His methods are brutal in the extreme, and he frequently kills criminals without remorse. Moore has stated in interviews on multiple occasions that he strictly views the character of Batman as a psychopath. Rorschach as a masked detective is the primary but not the only reflection of Batman in Watchmen, and while he is clearly the archetype of the male power fantasy that Batman represents in that he is feared, mysterious, and incredibly capable from a physical standpoint, he is morally reprehensible, socially withdrawn, and physically repugnant. His real identity is that of a homeless doomsday prophet with no regard for personal hygiene. He is the first side of a coin that tries to show the reader that the Batman archetype is something to be pitied, or at least suspect of, not an aspirational figure as he has mostly become to generations of people. The other side of that coin is Dan Dreiberg, or the second Night Owl. The son of a wealthy investment banker, Dreiberg uses his impressive inheritance to fund his inventions of the types that fuel the dignified man of science fantasy that Batman also fulfills. Having given up his cape and cowl after a government ban on masked vigilantes, the readers first meet Dan pathetically trying to live a normal life. Pudgy, impotent, and haunted by nostalgia, Dan eventually succumbs to his need for a life less ordinary through a midlife crisis brought on by the drama enshrouding his estranged comrade Rorschach and his romantic affair with Laurie Juspecic, the second Silk Spectre. Dreiberg, as an Ivy League-educated man of wealth, represents the more dignified side of the Caped Crusader's persona, but he's all the more frail for his softer nature, and a reminder of what problems well-meaning wealthy white men with childlike ideals rather than maniacal clowns or narcotics-crazed psychology professors. Laurie Juspecic, the daughter of a Polish migrant who became the original Silk Spectre, deals with the expectations of her mother as the main female superhero and the voice of feminist adversity against yet another world dominated by men. Her mother, Sally Juspecic, changed her name to Jupiter to avoid the indignation that migrants frequently suffer, though she, along with her publicist husband, welcomed the lustful attention her risque persona drew as the Silk Spectre. While a victim of attempted rape at the hands of the comedian, she ends up a hopelessly vain alcoholic wasting away in a retirement home for the most of the plot of Watchmen. Laurie's opposition towards her mother's appreciation of men's objectification of her paint Laurie as a feminist, but in many ways she faces the same problems her mother does against her male peers. She faces emotional manipulation as the younger sexual partner to Dr. Manhattan, and indignation from the government whose only expectations of Laurie is that of a state-sponsored prostitute. When she finds that she's had enough of Dr. Manhattan's determinist worldview and manipulation, she's driven into another man's arms. The softer, more fallible, yet charming and relatable Dan Dryberg. They together, despite, or perhaps through, Dan's sexual impotence, find their emotional needs are tied to taking a more active role in the world, and acting as their superhero personas is the only way they know how. Why Laurie is defined by the men in her life is one of the underlying criticisms one might take with Laurie as a feminist character, but she is representative of how Silver Age comics relegated women, though by the end of the story she becomes the common thread that brings out the few emotionally positive traits in a cast of reprehensible characters. She makes Dr. Manhattan appreciate humanity as something of value, and shows that the comedian, as despicable as he was, brought some good into the world through her. It could be said that, of all the characters in Watchmen, Laurie is the most undervalued and innocent. Dr. Manhattan, as the only being with superpowers in Watchmen, is a clear dissection of the flaws in the Übermensch idea. How would immortality, hyperintelligence, and near-limitless power affect the nature of a man? In Dr. Manhattan's case, it would drive him to near-total emotional detachment, it seems. Beginning life as John Osterman, son of a watchmaker, became a physicist and military research scientist. He dies in an accident with an intrinsic field distributor at the age of 30. Osterman's consciousness attempts to gruesomely reconstruct his body in several failed attempts, until he finally reappears as a blue-skinned super being in the middle of his workplace cafeteria. He is then immediately pressed into the service of the US government, wherein he is given the moniker of Dr. Manhattan for its association with the atomic bomb project. He becomes a crime fighter for a brief time and is then coerced into intervening in the Vietnam War, which results in America's victory a week later. As both a literal and metaphorical symbol of American military dominance and scientific superiority, Dr. Manhattan as a character frequently espouses his worldview through dictations about the material nature of reality. He can see into his own future, but, as he puts it, "We are all puppets. I'm just a puppet who can see the strings." He is eventually hounded by the press into believing he is responsible for giving cancer to some of his oldest estranged friends, and leaves Earth for Mars in a bid to distance himself from humanity, to whom he feels he can no longer relate. And yet, he is completely human in that he is driven by the need for attachment to others, even as he becomes colder emotionally. He is eventually driven away from a nihilistic view on humanity by his lover Laurie in a conversation on Mars, and even feels jealousy over her affair with Dan. The old Peter Parker principle of "with great power must come great responsibility" is the perfect ideal that Dr. Manhattan disproves. As a scientist and engineer, his responsibility has always been to his curiosity and his ingenuity, not to other people. Gaining his powers did not change his viewpoint. But even scientists, as pursuers of the material world's mysteries, need relationships with other people, not just professional ones, but shared vulnerabilities with people who care for them, as every human does. This makes his turning point with Laurie near the end of the book so alleviating, as for all his insights into the micro and macrocosmic wonders of the universe, he sees miraculous value in the near impossible odds of Laurie's existence. To see the most powerful being in existence admit that he was wrong is one of the few light spots in an otherwise pitch-black story. The comedian and Ozymandias, like Rorschach and Nightowl, are two sides of the same coin, but mainly in a philosophical sense. The comedian was designed to resemble Groucho Marx and be a mockery of civilization through his complete disregard for life, laws, and rights. He is the canonical assassin of John F. Kennedy in Watchmen. It's also implied that he is the assassin of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein before they could leak the Watergate scandal to the press. As mentioned before, he beats and nearly rapes Sally Juspechik. When the war in Vietnam is won, he ends up shooting a Vietnamese woman carrying his child over a disagreement about his responsibilities as a father. He was written to be the only truly unlikable character. Yet unlike all but Ozymandias, he is uncompromisingly perceptive about humanity's tendency towards self-destruction as an unavoidable existential threat, one accelerated by the existence of nuclear weapons. His joke, as the comedian, was to flaunt his disregard for civilization by acting as barbarically as he saw humanity to truly be. As his inspiration came from the likes of Nick Fury, Peacemaker, and other militaristic superheroes, the comedian reflects on the paradoxical morality we give to soldiers, spies, and other state-approved men of action. Because of much of what he has done has been in the service of his country, some might say he acts morally, but the character himself arguably wouldn't care for such assessments. Adrian Veidt, or Ozymandias, on the other hand, is seen as an altruist, as the smartest man in the world until the final part of the story. As a billionaire, technocrat, philanthropist, peak physical athlete, and energy mogul thanks to working with Dr. Manhattan on his inventions, he could be seen as an altruist compared to his peers, but ultimately he shares the comedian's convictions on human nature. Driven to his life as a vigilante by a vision quest trekking through the countries conquered by Alexander the Great, his lifelong hero, he reflects on Alexander's failures in the place of his burial as he ventures into the desert to consume hashish, and thusly discovers his life's purpose: to rid the world of the evils that beset men as a superhero. Ozymandias is reflective of the many qualities we see in hyper-successful business people to this day. Silicon Valley executives microdose with psychedelics for performance and work on massive information projects that now can be used to manipulate public interests. He's also beyond the reach of the government and the old world industries of fossil fuels. But while he starts the story as an apparent hero, his namesake gives way to his true nature if you understand the reference. His moniker is the Greek name for Ramesses II, one of the great pharaohs of Egypt, and the figure of the famous Percy Shelley poem from which the following phrase is often repeated: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." This piece of classical history serves as foreshadowing, as it is often regarded a remark of hubris, appropriately as Veidt brings about the deaths of millions through the explosive teleportation of genetically engineered monster corpses to 15 major cities in a gamut to force the US and Russia to set aside their differences and face a common enemy together. In spite of the unimaginable horror of this event, all but Rorschach agree to the outcome of Veidt's actions, as they have averted catastrophe and they must remain silent. Rorschach, being a moral absolutist, chooses death at the hands of Dr. Manhattan over dishonor. Proving that substantial change requires substantial compromise, Veidt's actions blur the morality of villainy and heroism, wounding the world to spare it from mutually assured destruction. But does that still make Ozymandias an altruist? This question rings loudly in the final horrific panels of the book, and the problem of the superhero fantasy becomes unavoidable, and brings on even more confronting questions once the book is over. Would we ever want people to see the world in terms of black and white, good and evil running around attacking criminals? Would they be justified in taking up such a cause? To what ends would the pursuit of absolute justice take these people? Am I, the reader, wrong to find such fascination with this fantasy? While the world of Watchmen had a host of problems affecting it that are easy to see parallels within our own world, like sociopathic social engineering billionaires, agitative and chaos-spewing media outlets, and frowning, jowl-flapping presidents backed by suspect cabinets in charge of nuclear weapons, Watchmen's place as a work of satire shows that the existence of costumed lunatics beating up the impoverished and uneducated for an ego trip wouldn't improve the world in the least. The warped reflections of the starry-eyed Silver Age of superhero comic book archetypes is only made more lasting by the refusal of mainstream mega publishers like DC and Marvel to grow up. But as the story shows, superheroes might be a broken concept celebrated by a broken species, and the end may always be near, but human beings will always need meaningful relationships with one another, not with their fantasies of power and renown.